For a long time, Emma Collins believed that love was something maintained silently, with effort and patience, like someone tending a sick plant hoping it would bloom again. At 34, she had been married for 6 years to Jake Collins, a man who once promised her the world. But over time, each of her lights slowly faded. When it all happened, Emma was working as a marketing manager at a book publishing house, living in a house she'd remodeled with her own hands, and spending her days trying to save a marriage that no longer existed. It was early fall when she insisted on celebrating the anniversary. 6 years deserved some kind of commemoration. Jake agreed, promising to take care of everything. "It's going to be a memorable night," he told her. And it was. But not for the reason she imagined. The chosen restaurant had an air of elegant intimacy. Warm lights hanging over small tables, wine glasses already poured, and a soft piano in the background. Emma arrived on time wearing a dark blue dress Jake often complimented. In her hands, she carried a picture frame with a photo of them taken during their first year of marriage. But when she entered, what she found wasn't a romantic moment or a reunion, but a rehearsed scene. Jake was already there, with his crooked smile, but he wasn't alone. Beside him were her parents, sitting as if it were all part of a carefully orchestrated act. Their presence seemed strange. They had never been warm to her, they always displayed that kind of dry courtesy, with phrases full of double entendres. Emma sat down, unaware that that night would become the most painful and liberating breaking point of her life. From the first minute, something in the atmosphere was different. Jake wore that smug expression, as if he were about to hand over a trophy, not celebrate an anniversary. Jake's mother, Lucille, wore a scarlet dress just striking for the occasion, and she smiled with those thin lips that never quite curved. His father, Gerald, barely glanced at her. When Emma tried to break the ice by asking about her grandchildren, Lucille interrupted her with a forced laugh, as if the question were absurd. Emma swallowed and kept her composure. She didn't understand why she felt like she was walking on glass, but something inside her screamed that she wasn't there to be celebrated. The waiter approached with already poured glasses of bubbly. Emma noticed there were more bubbles in the tension than in the drink. And then, without warning, Jake stood up, his glass raised. His voice echoed above the restaurant's murmur. "Here's to freedom," he said. Lucille and Gerald smiled knowingly. It took Emma a few seconds to process the sentence, but she didn't have time to react. Jake pulled a gift bag from under the table and placed it in front of her. "Happy anniversary, honey," he added, with a grimace that was meant to be a smile. Inside the bag was a neatly folded gray t-shirt. As she unfolded it, Emma felt as if the world had split in two. In bold letters, the shirt read 6 years of disappointment. There was laughter, suppressed laughter from Lucille, and a dry chuckle from Gerald. In that moment, with her hands shaking and her stomach in knots, Emma knew the whole thing had been planned, and that she was the only one who didn't know the script. The silence that followed was even more deafening than the laughter. Emma felt as if every eye in the restaurant had turned on her, even though no one had actually turned around. Heat rose in her chest and her eyes stung. But she didn't cry. She swallowed her tears like someone swallowing a bitter truth. Jake sat back as if nothing had happened, taking a sip of wine and dabbing the corner of his mouth with his napkin. Lucille made a low comment about having a sense of humor, while Gerald took a long sip of his whiskey. Emma, motionless, could barely breathe. Inside, something had broken. Not just love or trust, but something more intimate, the last shred of naivety she had left. And it was right there, in that break, that something else was born. The waitress, a young woman in her 20s with restless eyes, approached awkwardly to set down the first course. When she placed the plate in front of Emma, she barely whispered a sorry. It was so subtle that anyone would think it had been a sigh. But there was something in her gaze, in the way she avoided looking at Jake or his parents, that caught her attention. Emma looked up, and for a moment the two met in silent recognition. The waitress left quickly, but she left behind a suspicion vibrating in the air. Emma didn't know why, but she was certain that this girl knew more than she let on. And that intuition, faint as a spark, was what ignited in her the need to understand what was really going on. After that moment, Emma no longer tried to dissemble. She didn't fake smiles. She didn't ask questions. She observed. Every gesture, every word exchanged between Jake and his parents began to carry a different weight. Lucille spoke with an almost theatrical tone, as if the whole thing were a scene she'd written. Gerald nodded, barely saying anything, but his silence had an edge. Jake played with his fork, avoiding looking at her directly. Emma, who until that day had lived trapped in the desire to please, began to look at each of them as if they were strangers. People with whom she had shared entire years, but whom she had never truly seen clearly. And as the meal unfolded in a forced act, her mind was no longer there. It was on the waitress's words, on the t-shirt, on the toast, and on the certainty that there was something more beneath it all. After finishing her main course, Emma asked to go to the bathroom. It wasn't an excuse. She needed air. As she passed the kitchen, she discreetly glanced at the waitress and waved her over. The girl hesitated, looked around, and approached with short steps, as if crossing that distance would be dangerous. "I only have a minute," she murmured. Emma didn't know how to ask, but she didn't need to. The girl spoke quickly, directly. "He came by this afternoon. He brought that t-shirt. He said he wanted it to be a practical joke. That I shouldn't say anything." Emma felt her heart stop for a second. "And my in-laws knew." The waitress lowered her head. "Mrs. Lucille was the one who paid for everything. She said the child needs to be taught a lesson." It was at that instant that Emma understood. This wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was a complete conspiracy. Emma returned to her seat with a knot in her stomach, but her face no longer showed vulnerability. What had been confusion was now suppressed fire. Lucille's laughter, Gerald's sarcastic comments, Jake's avoidance of her, it all began to form a darker, more coherent puzzle. She had lived a carefully woven lie, surrounded by people who saw her as a nuisance or, worse, a convenient victim. For years, she had mistaken manipulation for tolerance, contempt for habit, cruelty for humor. But now she understood everything. And the most disturbing thing was the calmness with which she processed each revelation. It was as if, for the first time, she were observing from the outside. As if she could finally see her life without the veil of hope. She didn't say anything during dessert. She let them talk, let them feel safe, comfortable in their roles as executioners disguised as family. Lucille mentioned something about how difficult it was to deal with someone so sensitive, and Jake laughed knowingly. Gerald commented that sometimes you have to do what's necessary to make people grow up. Every word was another stab, but Emma didn't bleed. She just listened, memorized, stored. She wasn't going to confront them there. She wasn't going to scream or cry or give them the spectacle they wanted. She knew what she had on her hands was bigger. She'd seen in their eyes the certainty that they believed themselves untouchable. And in that blind conviction lay their weak spot. Emma didn't know how yet, but from that moment on, she began planning how she was going to bring them all down. That same night, when she got home, Emma didn't speak. Jake, intoxicated by his own ego, didn't notice his wife's calculated stillness. He showered, made trivial comments about the restaurant, and even hinted that it had been more fun than he thought. Emma watched him as if she were watching a foreign creature. When he fell asleep, she silently got up and grabbed her laptop. She didn't know where to start, but she began with the basics: his bank accounts, his recent transactions, the statements from the shared business he'd supposedly closed months ago. And there were the first traces, transfers to a certain Diane Harper, payments to a company that didn't legally exist, and hidden expenses on secondary cards. She didn't sleep that night. For the first time in years, Emma was wide awake. The next day, she took time off work, something she almost never did. She turned to a lawyer a colleague had recommended years before, just in case. The woman, a professional with a firm voice and direct eyes, greeted her without judgment. Emma told her everything, with surgical calm, the humiliation, the suspicion, the documents she had reviewed. The lawyer took quick notes, asked precise questions, and gave her a list of steps to follow. You have to protect your assets. Today, Emma canceled credit cards, blocked access, and transferred her personal savings to a new account. She also began the process of discreetly selling the house, which, luckily, was in her name. Every action strengthened her. It was like rebuilding her skeleton from the inside out. She didn't yet know how she would face Jake and his family, but she did know that she no longer belonged to them. Amidst all that silent storm, there was one name she couldn't get out of her head: Michael Collins, Jake's older brother. Emma had only seen him a couple of times at family gatherings where he always seemed like an uncomfortable shadow. She knew he'd been kicked out of the family for reasons that were never fully explained, but now she was beginning to understand. She remembered how Lucille avoided him, how Jake would change the subject whenever someone mentioned him. That's when she decided to look him up. She found his contact in an old Christmas group message. She wrote without much hope, just saying she needed to understand certain things from the past. To her surprise, Michael responded in less than 10 minutes. Tell me when and where. You're not the first to get burned by them. They met in a discreet cafe on the other side of town. Michael was different from Jake in almost every way. He had the same build, but his eyes were calmer, as if he'd been watching from afar for years. Emma told him what had happened, and he listened with an almost painful calm. When she finished, he took a deep breath and told her he wasn't surprised. He explained that he'd been disinherited for uncovering embezzlement his father and Jake were committing in the family business. That when he tried to report him, Lucille accused him of being a traitor and cut off all ties. This isn't personal, Emma. It's a repeated pattern. They chose you as their victim because you're good. Because they thought you'd never react. That phrase resonated with her for days. For the first time, someone validated her pain without minimizing it. And for the first time, Emma didn't feel alone. Over the following weeks, Emma and Michael began meeting frequently. What began as an exchange of information transformed into a shared strategy. Michael, who had accumulated evidence of irregularities at the company since leaving, found in Emma not only an ally, but someone willing to go all the way. Emma, for her part, felt that this unexpected connection was a kind of anchor amidst the shipwreck. Together they reviewed documents, reconstructed financial transactions, and assembled a dossier that left Jake and his parents on the brink. But Emma didn't just want justice. She wanted the truth. And above all, she wanted them to face public exposure the same way she had been exposed, with no chance of hiding. One afternoon, while organizing the files in Michael's study, a storm broke out outside. It was symbolic, Emma thought, as if the universe was also unloading all its accumulated burdens. In that tense atmosphere, her hands brushed Michael's as she picked up the same folder. It was a minimal gesture but charged with something more. They didn't speak of it at the time. They continued working, focused. But that night, when Emma returned home and closed the door behind her, she felt a surge of new emotions. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was the first time in years that her heart wasn't filled only with grief. And without fully realizing it, in the midst of a devastating legal and emotional process, Emma was beginning to be reborn. As the days passed, Emma became meticulous, almost surgical. She learned to feign normalcy around Jake, even though inside, his every word made her nauseous. She watched him with a coldness she hadn't known she possessed before. He didn't suspect a thing. He still believed she was weak, that humiliation had driven her into silence. But Emma was building something far more powerful than revenge. She was reclaiming her autonomy. Secretly, she sold the house with the help of a trusted real estate agent, moved the funds into an untouchable account, and removed her name from all shared assets. To protect herself, she recorded conversations, archived emails, and compiled every necessary document. She knew the moment was approaching. The moment to turn things around. One afternoon, while reviewing bank records, Emma discovered something that shocked her. Diane Harper, Lucille's assistant, was receiving monthly deposits from a secondary account in Jake's name. Digging deeper, she found photos Diane and Jake together at a cabin one weekend when he'd told her he was away on business. It was like another stab, but this time it didn't hurt the same. It wasn't a surprise anymore. It was confirmation. Confirmation that she'd never been loved, that she'd been used, and that all her pain had deep roots. She showed it to Michael, who clenched his jaw. I swear, they're not going to get away with this time. Emma said nothing. She just nodded, her determination needing no words. It was Michael who suggested the confrontation take place in a symbolic space. Do it somewhere they can't escape, where you're in control. And so, with the precision of an orchestra conductor, Emma chose the same restaurant as the anniversary. She reserved the center table, the same one where she'd been humiliated, and organized a special dinner to which she invited Jake, Lucille, Gerald, and, unbeknownst to them, Diane as well. She used vague words in the message, something like, "We need to talk about," The future of the family. Jake, egomaniac that he was, believed it meant a reconciliation or even an admission of defeat. Lucille responded with a curt, "We'll be there," and Emma, inside, already tasted the beginning of the end. The night of the dinner, Emma arrived dressed in an impeccable white suit, her hair elegantly tied back, and a twinkle in her eyes that had nothing tender about it. When Jake saw her, he made a surprised face, as if he couldn't understand how anyone could still be standing after all that. Lucille murmured something to Gerald, who looked at her with a mixture of annoyance and alertness. Diane arrived a few minutes later, flustered, and sat at the end of the table without looking directly at anyone. The atmosphere was charged, dense. Emma ordered wine, waited until everyone had their glass, and then stood up. "I want to toast tonight to the truth. Because enough of the lies." The exchanged glances began. Gerald frowned. Jake tried to smile. But Emma was no longer the woman she had been before. And they, for the first time, knew it. She took an envelope out of her purse and placed it on the table, right in front of Jake. "In here is proof of the irregular transfers you made over the past 2 years. There are also records of your relationship with Diane, in case you want to deny it." Diane immediately paled. Jake didn't have time to react when Emma slid another document in front of Lucille. "Here is the contract for the sale of the house. I no longer share any property with you or your son. And this one," she said as she pulled out a thicker folder, "is the report Michael and I prepared for the investors in the family business." With all the details of the embezzlement Gerald and Jake were part of, a silence fell over the table. The kind of silence that doesn't need shouting to be devastating. Lucille tried to laugh, as if it were an absurd scene. "And who's going to believe you?" she asked with that usual contempt. Emma looked at her, with lethal calm. "You know who's going to believe me, Lucille? The numbers don't lie. The evidence is ready. I sent it to the board's attorney this afternoon. And Michael, as the majority shareholder now that the documents have been revalidated, is going to press charges." Jake stood up abruptly, furious. "Are you crazy? This is nothing but revenge." Emma didn't flinch. "No. This is justice. And the best part is, I'm not finished." She turned to Diane. "You'll be in the report too, Diane. I hope you enjoyed your time with him. Because this is going to cost everyone dearly." That's when Emma sat down, took a sip of wine, and breathed as if she'd just crossed the last tunnel of her life. Gerald was the first to leave the table. He said nothing, didn't argue. He just stood up, grabbed his coat, and walked out of the restaurant, his face pale, as if everything he'd bottled up for years had finally collapsed on him. Lucille watched him go, completely paralyzed. For the first time, her absolute control had cracked. She tried to maintain her composure, but her hands were shaking. Diane, speechless, lowered her head and began to cry, stifling her sobs with a napkin. Jake, for his part, couldn't hide his fury. "This isn't going to stay like this, Emma. I'm going to ruin you." She looked at him fearlessly. "You already tried. You tried in front of everyone, with a mocking t-shirt and a pathetic toast. And look where you are now." There was no hatred in her voice. Only absolute clarity. A couple of tables around her had dropped their pretense of indifference. Some customers watched surreptitiously, others clearly curious about the unfolding drama. But Emma had no shame. What she felt in that moment wasn't humiliation, but dignity. She stood up, delicately placed her napkin on the table, and looked one last time at those who, for years, had made her believe she was worth less. "Thank you for showing me who you are. Because I too discovered who I am." She turned and walked out of the restaurant with firm steps, like someone leaving behind not just a dinner, but an entire life. Outside, the night air had a scent of freedom she couldn't remember having felt before. She walked on without looking back. And although she didn't yet know everything that would come next, one thing was certain: she would never be the same again. The following days were a whirlwind. Jake tried dozens of times to contact her, first with threats, then with pleas. Emma didn't return a single call. Her lawyer had already initiated divorce proceedings and blocked any further contact. The house was already sold, her money was protected, and the file she and Michael had compiled was in the hands of the relevant authorities. The family business was now facing a formal audit, and investors were beginning to demand explanations. Lucille, unable to control the narrative, turned to the media to defend the family's image, but everything she said rang hollow. Emma watched everything, From a distance, not with vengeance, but with a peace she hadn't felt in years. For the first time, she didn't need to win an argument to feel free. She already was. As time passed, her bond with Michael grew closer. It wasn't something planned or rushed. It just happened. After all, they were both coming from the same wound, albeit from different angles. They met to discuss legal developments, but little by little they began to share more: books, memories, comfortable silences. One afternoon, in the middle of a walk through a nearby park, Emma stopped suddenly and confessed, almost fearfully, that her period was late. Michael reacted not with fear but with tenderness. He accompanied her to take the test, waited with her in the waiting room, and when the result came back positive, he silently held her hand. "We're going to be okay," he told her. And for the first time in a long time, Emma believed him. Not because he said it, but because she felt it too. The news of the pregnancy wasn't a dramatic twist, but rather an intimate confirmation that life continued on, even after the chaos. Emma spent days digesting this new reality. It wasn't just a baby. It was the symbol of a new phase emerging from the rubble. A chapter that depended on no one else. She didn't feel fear, but she did respect what it meant. She knew her story with Michael was still under construction, that they both had fresh scars and many things to resolve. But she also knew that this child wasn't arriving on a battlefield, but rather on unspoiled territory, bravely won. Michael, for his part, didn't pressure her at any point. He simply remained present, listening and supporting. And that consistency was, for Emma, more valuable than any declaration of love. The divorce was resolved more quickly than expected. Jake, cornered by the investigations and without allies within the company, accepted the terms without much of a fight. He lost part of his stock, had to answer legally for the fraudulent transfers, and his public image deteriorated rapidly. Lucille tried to rebuild the ruins with false statements and expensive lawyers, but the truth had already been sown. Emma didn't celebrate this fall. She didn't gloat over other people's ruin. She just felt she could finally close that door without looking back. She changed her number, moved to a smaller but cozy apartment, and began working as an independent consultant, choosing her projects and, above all, her boundaries. It was the first time she didn't live to please others. She lived for herself and for the future growing inside her. The months of pregnancy passed with a mixture of introspection and gratitude. Emma learned to be with herself in a new way, without fear of silence, without needing external validation. Each ultrasound was a silent celebration, each movement inside her belly a reminder that she had survived. Not just public scorn, but years of emotional suppression. She returned to writing, a passion she had abandoned in marriage, and started a small, anonymous blog where she shared reflections on emotional rebuilding, toxic relationships, and autonomy. She didn't use her name, but many women began writing to her in gratitude. Without planning to, Emma had turned her experience into something useful. She no longer needed to talk about Jake or the Collins family. Her story now had a new protagonist, herself. Michael became a natural part of her daily life, without any impositions. They didn't live together, but they shared routines, decisions, and spaces. Emma established clear boundaries from the start, and he respected them with a patience that sometimes moved her. He was unlike anything she'd ever known. He didn't try to save her. He didn't overprotect her. He was just there. When she was 7 months pregnant, Michael suggested he accompany her to a prenatal class. During the session, while he held her hand and laughed nervously at the instructor's every instruction, Emma looked at him and felt a quiet certainty. She didn't know what the future held, but she did know that, for the first time, she had chosen well. Not out of fear or need, but out of recognition and calm. And that, for her, was a victory. Labor came one rainy morning, without warning, with mild contractions that turned into an emergency room in a matter of hours. Emma went to the hospital accompanied by Michael, who didn't leave her side for a second. During labor, she was afraid. Not of the pain, but of everything getting out of hand, of losing control just when she most needed to trust herself. But then, amid the pressure, the sweat and the shaking, she remembered that night at the restaurant. She remembered the humiliating t-shirt, Lucille's laughter, Jake's face. And then, she remembered how she had walked out of there standing, head held high. That image sustained her. She pushed hard, with anger, with love. And when the baby's cry filled the room, Emma burst into tears, not from exhaustion, from rebirth. They had a baby girl. They named her Ava, a name Emma had always secretly loved, but never felt free to share with Jake. Ava came into the world with wide eyes and a lock of dark hair twisting right in the center, like a cowlick. Michael held her with shaking hands, then handed her to Emma. In that moment, looking at her daughter, Emma understood something no therapist, friend, or book could have explained. She had won. Not because the others had lost, but because she had saved what mattered most: her dignity, her essence, her right to start over. And most sacred, she had protected her daughter from a toxic emotional legacy. She had broken the cycle. The first few months with Ava were exhausting, but also revelatory. Emma discovered a strength within herself she'd never known before. The sleepless nights, her daughter's tears, the constant self-doubt, all of it brought her face to face with older versions of herself. Sometimes she was afraid she wasn't doing it right. Other times, she found herself crying while Ava slept, just because. But even in the fatigue, there was a clarity that never left her. She wasn't alone, and she no longer lived for others. Michael was still there, not as a hero, but as a partner who was also learning with every step. He wasn't trying to fix anything in her, and that gave her room to grow without pressure. For the first time, Emma felt unconditionally accepted. One morning, as they walked along a park path with Ava asleep in the stroller, Emma stopped dead in her tracks. She looked around: blossoming trees, children playing, warm sunshine filtering through the leaves. And in that instant, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: true peace. Not the feigned calm she'd cultivated for years to sustain an empty marriage, but an authentic serenity, born when the skin no longer burns from open wounds. "I never thought it would be so difficult. Or so beautiful," she murmured, almost to herself. Michael smiled without saying anything. Sometimes the answers don't come in the form of grand declarations, but in the simple act of continuing to walk alongside someone who understands silence. As time passed, Emma stopped having nightmares about that anniversary dinner. She no longer woke up startled by the memory of Jake's voice toasting freedom, nor did she feel rage at the thought of the T-shirt. What had once been an open trauma was now a firm scar. It was still there, yes, but it no longer hurt. To the touch. There were days when someone mentioned the Collinses, and she would simply smile with learned indifference. Her lawyer kept her up to date on pending legal proceedings, but Emma had decided not to get more involved than necessary. She preferred to devote her energy to Ava, to her personal projects, to the small everyday victories she had previously disregarded. She discovered that true triumph lay not in destroying those who had hurt her, but in no longer revolving around them. One afternoon, while organizing some old boxes in her new apartment, she found the picture frame she had brought to the restaurant that day. Inside was still the photo, her and Jake on their first year of marriage, smiling, embracing in front of a lake. For a second, she thought about throwing it away, but something stopped her. She took out the photo, looked at it closely, and noticed something she hadn't seen before. His eyes weren't smiling as much as his mouth. She put the empty frame in a drawer and tore the photo into small pieces, almost delicately. Not out of hatred, but out of emotional cleansing. It was a symbolic way of saying goodbye to that old version of herself, the one that clung to what hurt, the one that begged for crumbs disguised as love. And in doing so, she felt lighter. It was thanks to the anonymous blog that Emma began to understand the true scope of her journey. More and more women wrote to her telling similar stories: partners who annulled them, in-laws who manipulated them, relationships where humiliation disguised itself as habit. Some did so with anger, others with guilt, many with a mixture of both. Emma read each message with respect, knowing that in each word was an old version of herself seeking release. Sometimes she responded, sometimes she just needed to read and feel that her story was no longer hers alone. Without planning it, her testimony became a meeting point for others like her. She never revealed her identity, but those women didn't need to know her name to feel they weren't alone. And that, in itself, was a form of healing. Once, she received a particularly long email from a woman named Clara. She had been married to a man who, like Jake, publicly outed her and then tried to ruin her emotional stability. Clara ended her message by saying, "I don't know who you are, but you gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever, The right to start over. Emma cried when she read that. Not out of sadness but out of appreciation. She realized that everything she'd experienced, from the humiliation in that restaurant to the sleepless nights holding Ava, had a larger meaning. It didn't justify the pain, but it gave it shape. She'd turned the shipwreck into a beacon. And now, from her own place of rebuilding, she could offer light to others still searching for shore. As the years passed, Ava grew up in a home where the word love wasn't shouted, but was demonstrated every day. Michael remained a constant figure, present but not intrusive. Emma explained to her early on that she didn't need hasty labels. "We're building something day by day," she used to tell her friends when they asked if they were together. And yes, they were together. Not out of obligation, not out of fear of loneliness, but because they both chose to be. They raised Ava with sincere agreements, shared laughter, and respected silences. Emma looked at her daughter and thought, she won't grow up believing she has to beg for affection. And that was enough. Because if she had learned anything along that path, it was that wounds don't disappear, but they stop ruling your life when you allow yourself to truly heal. One night, while Ava slept and Michael made her tea in the kitchen, Emma leaned out onto her apartment balcony. The city was quiet, with that faint hum you only notice when your soul is also silent. She hugged herself, not out of cold but out of gratitude. She thought of the Emma from 6 years ago, the one who had sat at that table with a hopeful heart and emerged shattered. She thought also of the woman who emerged from those pieces stronger, clearer, truer to herself. She didn't feel like a hero or a survivor. She just felt human. And in that moment of stillness, she knew that everything she'd been through, even the darkest, had brought her exactly where she was. And that, finally, was enough. Sometime later, during a walk alone along the beach where she used to go with her parents as a child, Emma stopped in front of the sea and closed her eyes. She felt the wind on her face, her bare feet on the warm sand, and that eternal murmur of the waves that seemed to embrace her without holding her tight. She remembered something her mother used to tell her: the sea always returns what you throw at it. Sooner or later, she thought of everything she had thrown into the universe: patience, silence, unrequited love, and also courage, limits, determination. And there she was, standing, receiving back something completely different, a life of her own. Not perfect but her own. Not designed to fit into someone else's molds, but created in the exact shape of her soul. For the first time, she didn't need any more proof of anything. She had found the shore. In a small notebook she carried in her purse, Emma jotted down a single sentence that afternoon: "I don't have to prove anything to anyone anymore." It wasn't a loud declaration nor a loud revenge. It was an intimate truth, born of exhaustion and clarity. Since leaving Jake, many people had asked her how she found the courage. Some were looking for inspiration, others simply gossip. But Emma never responded with details. She would simply say, "I had a day where I couldn't take it anymore. And I decided that was enough, because, in the end, there is no master plan or manual for liberation. Sometimes it starts with a mean t-shirt, an empathetic waitress, a folder of documents, and sometimes it simply starts with looking in the mirror and no longer recognizing herself. However it happens, it comes. And when it comes, it is not forgotten." Sometime later, Emma was invited to give a short talk at an event for women entrepreneurs. At first, she hesitated. She didn't see herself as a public figure or an inspiration. But she accepted for a very clear reason. She wanted to speak to just one woman in that room who was perhaps on the brink of the same abyss she knew so well. She took the stage without paperwork or a written speech. She spoke from the wound, but also from the healing. She shared how the pain didn't define her, but it did transform her. She didn't name names, didn't expose unnecessary details. She spoke only of how, one day, in a restaurant, someone tried to annihilate her dignity with a cruel joke. And how, years later, she had learned to laugh again, but this time, at something truly worth laughing at. When she stepped off the stage, a woman with short hair and tired eyes approached her. She didn't say much. She just hugged her along in silence. Emma knew they didn't need to exchange stories. Sometimes, what unites people isn't what they've experienced, but what they've felt. That night she returned home with a renewed serenity. Not because the past was gone, but because she no longer carried it like a cross. She carried it like a scar on her soul, one she didn't try to hide. Because she understood it wasn't a sign of weakness, but of survival. And surviving, for her, didn't just mean staying alive. It meant loving again, trusting again, starting over, even if it was from scratch. Even if her legs were shaking. One morning, as she prepared breakfast and Ava scampered barefoot around the kitchen, Emma watched her from the doorway with a mixture of tenderness and wonder. Watching her daughter grow was like watching a version of herself blossom without fear, without invisible chains, without needing to fit into broken molds. In that moment, she understood that the true legacy she would leave her wouldn't be a fortune or a fairy tale. It would be the truth. The truth of a woman who one day hit rock bottom, but chose not to stay there. Who rebuilt herself with new pieces, not to be the same again, but to be someone better. Someone freer. Someone more aware. Later, while Ava napped on her chest and Michael read on the couch, Emma closed her eyes for a moment. She felt the warm weight of her daughter's body, the calm breathing of someone who has yet to experience fear. And then she knew with a certainty that needed no explanation. It had all been worth it. Every tear, every sleepless night, every difficult decision. Because the life she had now wasn't a prize nor a revenge. It was a conquest. And the most beautiful thing of all was knowing that she didn't owe that life to anyone else. She had given it to herself. With her own hands. With her own courage. And with the unshakable conviction that no woman should have to hit rock bottom to remember her worth. As time passed, Emma once again found moments of joy that weren't marked by achievement, but simply by presence. A random afternoon in the park. A spontaneous laugh at Ava getting ice cream all over her face. A comfortable silence with Michael as they shared coffee. These details became the pillars of her new existence. She no longer lived waiting for grand gestures or extraordinary turns of events. She learned that true peace lay in the everyday, in knowing that home isn't a physical place, but an internal sensation. A place from which one can inhabit oneself without fear, without hiding. And finally, Emma inhabited her own life without asking permission. In one of her last blog posts, she wrote something that summed up everything she'd experienced. Sometimes, surviving is the most revolutionary act. But living, truly living, with all your heart, is the silent miracle no one teaches you. That phrase was shared by hundreds of women, forwarded, quoted, and adapted. Emma read it with humility. Not because she wanted recognition, but because she understood the power of a story well told. Hers, in the end, wasn't just a tale of betrayal, but a declaration of autonomy. Proof that you can lose everything and still regain yourself. That was her greatest achievement. Not the punishment of the guilty, not the judgment one, but the intimate reconstruction of a woman who, one day, said enough and started over. One day, while picking up Ava from kindergarten, one of the teachers smiled at her and said, "Your daughter always stands up for others. When a classmate cries, she's the first to hug them. She has a quiet strength, just like you." Emma was silent for a second, moved. She had never considered what her daughter absorbed beyond words. She understood, then, that Ava wasn't just growing up far from the chaos Emma had experienced, but was learning from example what self-love, respect, and empathy meant. That was the true legacy, not material possessions, not titles or external achievements, but the ability to look at others without judgment, to pick yourself up after a fall, to not remain where it hurts. Later that night, as she tucked Ava into bed and turned off the moon-shaped nightlight, Emma allowed herself one last reflection. The past was no longer a prison or a dark pit. It was part of her story, yes, but not her definition. And while she would never forget what she'd experienced, she wouldn't allow it to guide her anymore. Now she lived with her feet planted firmly, her back straight, and her heart open. She didn't need revenge. She didn't expect apologies. She was no longer the woman who expected something from someone who never knew how to give. And that in itself was freedom. A freedom that depended on no one. That couldn't be stolen. That she had cultivated alone. And now she slept peacefully beside her daughter, wrapped in the stillness of a life finally her own. A few years passed. Ava grew up, surrounded by books, laughter, and difficult questions that Emma learned to answer honestly, even when they hurt. She never hid her story from her, but she didn't turn it into an inherited trauma either. She spoke to her about the value of setting boundaries, the danger of confusing love with submission, and the essential nature of listening to one's own intuition. Sometimes, when Ava asked about that family, Emma chose to share only what was necessary, because she understood that healing wasn't about repeating the pain, but about learning not to carry it with her. Michael remained a part of her days, not as a replacement or a savior, but as a true companion human, imperfect and deeply loyal. Their bond had silently endured over time, not out of necessity, but by daily choice. One autumn morning, as the three of them walked through an outdoor book fair, Ava ran up to a booth and grabbed a children's picture book. "Mom, can I take this one?" she asked with that happy urgency only children possess. Emma nodded, smiling. She looked around, breathed in the cool, soft air, and felt that, finally, everything made sense. Not because life was perfect, but because she'd stopped expecting perfection. She'd learned to love the messiness, to respect her past without surrendering to it, and to be grateful for every step, even the hardest ones. Because if she knew one thing now, it was this: sometimes the bravest thing a woman can do isn't walk away. It's to come back to herself, completely, without permission or apologies. The blog that once began as an anonymous outlet eventually evolved into a small self-published book. Emma published it without great expectations, with a simple title, "What I Learned When I Was Left Alone." She wasn't looking for fame or validation, she just wanted closure. To her surprise, the book began circulating among women in different countries: mothers, daughters, lawyers, nurses, writers, everyday women with similar wounds. In every message she received, Emma found a part of herself reflected. It wasn't the thank yous that moved her most, but the simple phrases like "I saw myself in your words" or "Now I know I'm not crazy," because that was what had torn her apart the most at the time, believing she was alone, exaggerating, being too sensitive. One day, late at night, she received an email that left her frozen in front of the screen. It was from the restaurant waitress. That whispered "I'm sorry" had been, for Emma, the first thread of liberation. The young woman told her she'd followed her story, recognized her from an interview, and had always wanted to say something. "That night I thought you were going to break. But you didn't. And you gave me courage to. Thank you for not yelling, for not taking revenge, for just getting up and leaving." Emma closed the computer, her eyes brimming with tears. Life had given her back everything that was taken from her, but in new, unexpected, profound ways. Because in the end, what matters isn't what's taken from us, but what we choose to rebuild with what's left. Today, Emma is no longer defined by what she experienced that anniversary night. But she doesn't forget it either. Because it was at that exact moment where history changed direction. Where a quiet woman discovered her own voice. Where an obedient wife became a mother, a writer, a beacon for others. Where a public humiliation sowed the roots of a private freedom. And if someone were to ask her today what she would do differently, she would smile thoughtfully and answer honestly, "Nothing, because all of that brought me here, and I'm fine here."